Greetings, U.S. history students. This video is on topic 1.2, which is about Native Americans prior to European contact. European contact happened in 1492 when Christopher Columbus and several Spanish conquistadors began the process of colonization in the Americas. And so this video is going to focus on what Native American societies were like before interactions with European groups and the rest of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The big concept to get is right here that Native American societies prior to 1492 developed different and complex communities that both transformed and adapted to their diverse environments. This means that Native Americans were impacted by where they lived, the type of weather, the type of soil, type of animals. And because of those experiences, it changed their cultural and political practices. Now, there are two regions to be aware of when we're discussing Native American groups in U.S. history. The first one is Native American groups that lived in Central America, so on our map right here, and South America. These groups developed large, highly developed civilizations that were based around large cities. So for the Aztecs, who developed in Mesoamerica, right here, Central America, where modern day Mexico is, the Aztecs had a large city called Tenochtitlan that housed somewhere around 200,000 people, and this is the center of their empire. And their empire was very large. Lots of people spoke the same language, interacted, and followed under the same government practices. In South America, we see this with the Inca, and they had large urban centers as well. What led to these large empires in Central and South America? Well, it was agriculture and the diffusion of maize and potatoes. So in Central America, maize cultivation, maize farming led to a high population. Maize is also known as corn. And then this high population led to large cities. And then within these large cities, we had different social groups that emerged and new cultural practices that were based around the growth of corn. The same thing happened in South America with potatoes. Potatoes were grown in South America along the Andes because it was a crop that could survive in a shorter growing season with colder temperatures. So we see geography impacting these regions. You could grow maize in Central America because it's a longer growing season, it's a warmer area, so that you could grow corn. You couldn't grow corn along the Andes as well, so they grew potatoes, and they based their societies around that. Now, in North America, or when I say North America, I mean like the area of the continent that is where the United States is today, you're going to see far more diversity. You're not going to have any massive empire of hundreds of thousands of people like what existed with the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas. Instead, you're going to get a bunch of smaller tribal settlements or tribal civilizations scattered across the continent. These groups typically were about 100 to 300 people in size. Why are they so small? Well, that's because farming practices like maize and agriculture slowly diffuse throughout the region. Maize cultivation will become prominent throughout most of North America, and farming will be very common as well. But because it arrived later here than it did in Central America, it's going to prevent the ease of making large empires. Now, some things about these Native American groups, they are mostly going to be permanent or semi-permanent settlements, meaning these folks lived in one place from one year to the next. They weren't migrating across the continent. That's not the case for every Native American group. Like if you lived in the Great Plains, there's a high likelihood that you actually were nomadic, meaning you traveled from one place to the next and didn't live in the same location all the time. This occurred because of your geography. Again, our main idea. If you lived in the Great Plains, it's hard to grow crops. It's hard to farm. So instead, you lived off of hunting the bison, and you were forced to travel with the bison herds and live a nomadic existence. If you didn't live in the Great Plains, you were able to grow crops or hunt and gather in one spot from one year to the next. So we see far more permanent settlements or semi-permanent settlements than nomadic groups. It's also worth pointing out that there's extreme diversity between these small tribal organizations. We're going to have different languages, different cultures, and different political organizations. And this is because, again, there's no massive empires in North America, and you also have a lot of different geographic regions. If you live in the southeastern part of the continent, it's a lot different than living in the northwestern part of the continent. And since the geography was different, each group was impacted differently by its surroundings, and they had to adapt to their geographic environment and also were impacted They also impact that region as well. So this last slide here is just a couple examples of these different geographic regions that Native American groups lived in North America and how they adjusted to their environment or how they transformed their environment to make it more accountable to their existence. And again, our big idea is that Native American societies developed different and complex communities based on the geography that they lived in. So in the Southwest, this area here, groups like the Pueblo, the Hohokam, the Anasazi, they're living in an arid environment. And so they had to use irrigation practices to reroute the water to help them grow maize. Maize cultivation will arrive here first because it diffuses from Central America. And they'll grow corn. They'll live in settled societies because corn's available there, but they need to constantly reroute rivers to build these permanent civilizations. They also built their homes out of things like adobe and clay because there's not a ton of trees in the Southwest. And so you can't build these sort of cabin-like structures. You have to use what's available. And they had a lot of clay, and they used the irrigated water to make that clay malleable for buildings. If we go to the Northwest, this is a totally different geographic environment. They're going to have lots of trees. They're going to be located along the coast. So they're going to have access to fishing. There's going to be more animals that exist in this area because it's more hospitable than the deserty areas of the Southwest. So these groups, like the Chinook in the Northwest, are going to develop permanent settlements. They're going to build long houses out of wood because there's lots of wood in the area, and they'll survive by fishing and hunting and gathering in locations. They also preserve their culture by creating totem poles, which again are made out of trees and wood, something that people in the Southwest couldn't do because there really were no trees in the Southwest, or there was a lack of trees to do that. If we go to the Great Plains, there were some groups that lived in semi-permanent settlements, and that's because of maize cultivation that's diffusing from the Southwest and continuing to spread throughout the parts of the Great Plains and further northeast and southeast. But because it's so dry in the Great Plains and hard for agriculture at this time, most groups don't embrace farming and instead have a nomadic existence. And they'll use teepees to travel from place to place. You can tear down these structures quickly, and you can also put them back up quickly. And they're going to follow the bison herds. And these bison herds traveled across the Great Plains, and these groups survived off the meat from the bison and the fur and the skin or the hides of the bison. And they're going to travel across the region living a nomadic existence instead of a settled existence because they're surviving off of the bison. So that's, again, the geography. Because they can't really farm as easily here and they have bison to survive off of, these groups became nomadic instead of settled. There's a picture of a bison for you right there. And then our last example of groups emerging would be the Midwest and the Atlantic seaboard, the Northeast and the Southeast. These groups, like the Hopewell, the Cahokia settlement, and the Iroquois Confederacy, lived off of a mix of agriculture, hunting and gathering, and really had an abundance of resources. Because there was more food available and more ways to survive, you're going to see higher populations. And with more populations, you're going to see more settlements. The Midwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast were the most crowded regions of North America because they had the most people living there because the geography was very hospitable, very easy to live in those locations. Kind of a unique development here is you're going to get places like Cahokia. Cahokia is this image above. It's this large settlement in modern-day Illinois. And Cahokia was the largest North American settlement prior to European contact. They had several thousand people living in the settlement, which was different than most North American settlements prior to 1492. So that makes it unique. But that's possible because they had a lot of places to farm, they had abundance of food, and they were able to have these large populations to make a large urban center like what you would see in Central and South America. These groups in the Midwest and the Atlantic seaboard typically prospered due to a rich food supply. And because there was this greater amount of resources, we have greater population density, which led to more interactions. With more tribal interactions, you also got more conflict between tribes competing for better farmland and better access to resources. So you saw new political organizations emerge, like confederacies, these alliances between tribes. A good example of this is the Iroquois Confederacy, 5 tribal groups in what is now upstate New York that allied together and created a political organization to dominate the region. They did this because since there was competition for resources, they figured 5 tribes together were better than one. and they were able to fight against competition and competitors in the area to be successful there. So again, our big idea is that Native American societies were influenced by their geography, and they also influenced their geography as well prior to European contact. Have a great day.